Hello, welcome to the Nothing Human Podcast live question and answer session number 15. And things look a little bit different today because I have been working on my lighting and such here. And I also have a camera that I started using recently that my friend Jeremiah Smith gave to me quite a little while ago, but I had not done anything with it until like really, really recently. I feel kind of bad. So he gave me this Sony A7, and it works really well. He also gave me a capture card, so it goes directly into the computer. So it looks pretty good. Um, I don't really have anything much planned for today, but if you're there on the chat, you can let me know that you're here and let me know if you have any questions or anything like that that you want me to talk about. I did want to discuss a little bit well, I was talking to my friend Jeremiah actually today. We recorded some material for a podcast that for the Renew the Arts podcast. He's pretty majorly into. I'm gonna tweak this a little bit. He's pretty majorly into the AI world, and so he is a good person to talk to. He's been kind of at the cutting edge of that for quite some time. And he wanted to talk about AI with me for the Renew the Arts podcast because I've been doing some work about AI and the arts and things like that. But we ended up talking kind of about the future of humanity. We talked about how there's really no such thing as no bias in the viewpoints that people have. And so we were saying both that we appreciated when people disclosed their bias. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a bias that I have that I think is biblical, but I wanted to distinguish it from some other biases that other people also claim are biblical. So you probably know about like end times views, that there are various different kinds of end times views. You've probably heard like premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial, these kinds of things. And I was raised as a postmillennialist, and for a long period of my life, I would have claimed to be a postmillennialist. I basically still am. Sweet. All right, mom's on. She finally got connected. And I I don't know that I would necessarily call myself a post millennialist as such, but a lot of the views that I'm about to talk about, as far as a disclosing of my bias, um, refer to that, or probably will make you think that that's what I am. Okay, but basically, there's a text in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul is talking about the resurrection, the final resurrection, at the end, and I there's a part of that that I think is really interesting. So he's talking about the resurrection, and it's in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 22 through 26. And he says, "For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, after that those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death." So we know that the last enemy to be abolished is death, is what it says. And that idea, in the final resurrection, the resurrection of the body, which is a general resurrection of all people who have lived and died, and even those who haven't died yet will be changed, it says in this text. But the verse I want to focus on that I think is really interesting is verse 24, where it says, "Then comes the end when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power." I think that it's really easy to think, then comes the end. And you almost mentally would read this verse in this way, where it says, "Then comes the end when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father, when he will abolish all rule and all authority and power." Even that is kind of strange because it's like, well, he is the king, he's the king of the universe. what's this idea of like handing over the kingdom to God that Jesus does, and then what is the abolition of all rule and all authority and all power? Well, I I've talked to my kids about it. You know, I say that a lot, but I've asked them, are where or when or in what circumstance would it be the case that rules, authority, and power are not necessary? Are there any circumstances, contexts, communities, etc., where there is not any necessity for rule, authority, and power? And really, like, you might ask, what is the purpose of rule, authority, and power in the economy of God currently? Because obviously we live in a time when there is rule and authority and power, sometimes used and abused, used badly and abused, other times used more properly or effectively. But one way or the other, what's the purpose of it, or why is it necessary? So I'm going to leave that with the chat if there's anybody. I know my mom is here, so she can answer on the chat, and I will wait. What is the purpose of rule and authority and power in the current economy? So, like, basically right now, because there is rule and authority and power. Why is it there, and what is it necessary for? And so I'll give you a second to think about it. And if you're there or you're watching on the chat and you want to comment, please do and let me know. I apparently the comments do work today, so that's great. I'll give you a second. I think my mom might be the other one here. Hi, Mom. Love and kisses. XOXO, etc., etc. So I'll explore this a little bit more. Social order. Okay. Vanessa, my wife, and my mom and my wife. It was fantastic. So yeah, social order. I think yes, to create social order. So the as Romans 13 says, that the purpose of the government in right to keep order. Good. All right. So the purpose of government is to restrain the evildoer, particularly, just to do that, and that has the effect of protecting those who are not doing evil, who are not doing harm in the society. But it is to restrain evil, really, is the purpose of rule and authority and power when properly used. It's obviously not always properly used, it's oftentimes abused. But it does create order and restrain evil. So, in what circumstance or in what context would there be no necessity to restrain evil? Where or when would evil not need restraining? And there is a case. I mean, there is a case to be made that you do not need rule, authority, and power for a people who do not want to do what is wrong. So if rule and authority and power are necessary to restrain the people from doing the evil that they want, or the wicked things that they want, the harm of others, the thefts, the murders, the adulteries, the idolatries, the blasphemies, the profanings of holy things, all this kind of stuff that degrades society and makes it less livable for people even who are doing what they're supposed to be doing. There's the only way that you would be able to remove that rule, remove that authority, remove that power is if largely the people of the communities were at large righteous people, like who wanted to do what was right. And you might think, well, that'll never happen. But the thing is that in some sense, it already is happening. And again, this is where I'm disclosing my bias. I think that you can see really clearly that society in general, people in general, are actually moving in a direction where more and more a lot of their behaviors are constrained by a sense of morality without force, which is strange to say. But I'll say, for instance, that people that, like, okay, I'll just say me and my family, this community, I was telling them, I don't need the police to keep me in order. like I I would not really need to have any dealings with the police. You could you could never have the police here in this community, and I would never go and murder or steal or whatever. And if I hurt my neighbor or did anything like that, and they were like, "Hey, that hurts. I don't like that," I would try and make it right. And I'm not alone. There are a lot of people like that. And those people don't need rule, authority, and power to restrain them from doing wrong things because I simply don't want to do wrong things. So if there's ever a time, and notice this is the simple aorist tense in 1 Corinthians 15 where it says when he has abolished, meaning this is a past tense reality, meaning before the end comes, because it says then comes the end when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father when he has abolished, meaning that it has already been done. It's already been accomplished, that rule, power, and authority has been abolished by Jesus in time before the end. And you think, well, how is that possibly going to happen? And I would say the only way that that is possible for that to happen is if, generally speaking, the nations are actually his disciples. The nations are actually following after him. Now, that should remind you that if you look and you check out the Great Commission, Matthew 28, you'll see that he says, all rule and power and authority has been given to me, meaning Jesus already has all rule, power, and authority. And he says, go therefore, meaning for this reason, go and make the nations Christ's disciples. Make it so they follow after me as my disciples. And notice it doesn't say that people from the nations will be his disciples. That is true. But it actually says, go and make the nations themselves Christ's disciples, meaning that whole communities of people, whole groups of people are meant to be discipled into following Jesus. Now, this is the case if he gave you if Jesus gives you a command and says, go and do this, but it's not possible, it'll never happen. That's ridiculous. Like, why would he ever give you a command if it weren't possible for you to fulfill that command? And if you're, not necessarily convinced by that, what about the Lord's Prayer, which he says for you to pray? And again, I'll be talking about this in the next episode, which I'm still preparing because it's a super deep dive into the nature of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of heaven on earth. But what's interesting about the Lord's Prayer section where it talks about your kingdom come, meaning your kingdom fully arrive, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, if you look at that, it's an imperative, meaning that you are commanding God, respectfully, but you are commanding God to accomplish this petition. And how could you give him an imperative? Well, I've talked about it on the podcast. The only way that you could give God an imperative concerning that is if it were based on a promise that he had already made, or it was something that he was certainly going to do. So when you think about that, it's like, well, if it is the case that the will of God will be done on earth as it is in heaven, which it's done perfectly in heaven, if that is the trajectory or that is the goal that God is working toward, and he will not be satisfied until it's done, so much so that he's asking you to pray. He's telling you, pray like this to me, tell me that this is what you want to be done. And then he's also commanding us and saying, go therefore and make the nations Christ's disciples. That would indicate that that's going to happen. That is going to happen. There was the reason why we even got on this is because one of my kids in their Bible study session, was looking at Psalm 87, and we looked at Psalm 87, and it's really interesting. I want to talk about this a little bit. Psalm 87 says, I'll just read the whole thing. So, his foundation is in the holy mountains. Yahweh loves the gates of Zion more than all the other dwelling places of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God. I will mention Rahab and Babylon among those who know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia, this one was born there. But of Zion it shall be said, this one and that one were born in her, and the Most High himself will establish her. What's interesting about this to me is that it does not say, I shall mention from Rahab, or from Babylon, that there are from there those that know me. It actually says, I will mention Rahab and Babylon among the nations that know him, including Philistia, Tyre, and Ethiopia. Those are nations. Those are whole like political organizations. And what's really interesting about the verse 4 where it says, I shall mention Rahab and Babylon, and perhaps you don't know this, and it's fine. Rahab or Rahab was a name that was associated with Egypt, so it may refer to Egypt. It's also the name of Rahab the harlot, who was a Canaanite, but she was named after Rahab the goddess, who was a goddess. It was a serpent. It was a river serpent goddess who was the basically goddess of chaos and disorder. And if you know anything about the yin and yang and ancient concepts of order and disorder, chaos and disorder was necessary for the generation of life. But in order to keep it bounded and productive, you needed rule, right? So you had like disorder and insurrection, rebellion, revolution, and that was figured in this serpent goddess Rahab, who was basically like the goddess of chaos, the goddess of disorder, and you can even see that there are various different serpent goddesses of disorder or chaos that are mentioned in the Ugaritic cycle. The Baal worshippers had their goddess of disorder, and that's really an ancient idea. Lots and lots of peoples had like this this chaos god who was almost always a goddess. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on what that means about the ancient perspective on male and female. It's also the case that with yin and yang, yang represents the sun, represents order, represents light, brightness, everything that's structured. And then on the other side, you have the yin, which is the moon, which is the darkness, which is woman. Yang was male, yin was woman. So this is like very typical of ancient dualism between order and disorder, chaos and order. You also have this in Greek culture, where you have, Nietzsche picks up on this when he talks about the conflict between Dionysius, who is the god of, he was a god, okay, so not a goddess, but god of disorder and of fertile, and also including drunkenness and just general chaos, but that was fertile with life and productivity. And then Apollos, which is the god on the other side of Dionysius, who is the god of order and mathematics and music and or constructing things and putting them in their boxes. And so this is a concept that goes back all the way back into ancient times. So Rahab, in this sense, would represent the forces of disorder that are in political systems, political disorder, national disorder, insurrections, revolutions, those kinds of things. On the other hand, Babylon, as you know, in the Old Testament, Babylon is not a different word than Babel. In Hebrew, Babylon and Babel are actually the same words, just Babel. So this is really Babel and it references back to the Babel of the Old Testament in Genesis, where they built a tower to heaven as a different gate to heaven to bring earth to heaven, rather than waiting for heaven to come to earth, and to make a name for themselves. And in some sense, Babel, since the Tower of Babel all the way to the very end of Revelation, where Babylon represents this alternative order, Babel really is man's attempt at autonomous order without succumbing to or submitting to the rules or laws of God. So you can see you've got Babel on one side, which is the alternative order in rebellion against God's order, and then you have Rahab on the other side, which is chaos, insurrection, and revolution, which is also in rebellion against God's order. So you really have these two directions, these two bifurcations, or one bifurcation, where Babylon and Rahab really represent antinomianism or anti-law, libertinism on one side, and then what really amounts to legalism on the other side. It's the right hand and the left hand of chaos and disorder, and the right hand of constructed order, alternative to the order of God. Okay, now notice Psalm 87 says, I will mention Rahab on one side, Babylon on the other, among those who know me, meaning these political systems that are representative of rebellion against God are eventually going to be citizens of the city of God, Zion. And if you notice, there it's a really interesting thing when you think about what is Zion, or where is Zion, or what is Zion. Mount Zion also pretty sure. So again, it says his foundation is in the holy mountains. The mountain of Mount Zion was in kind of there was like a mountain range ish thing. But the actual Temple Mount, the hill or the mountain where the temple actually was built, you remember, was built by Solomon originally. David purchased the land. David was on that spot when he was looking upon Jerusalem when Jerusalem was spared. I don't know if you remember this either, so I'll just go into it. But when David was king, he had a major failure, both a personal failure and a failure as a king. So he had both a personal failure with Bathsheba and Uriah, and then he also had a political failure, or a failure as a king, when he numbered the people and took a census in order to basically have a standing army, which God took as David not trusting in God for protection, but rather trying to establish himself and establish his own strength in order to protect what he had gained in the kingdom. So that God says basically, hey, I am displeased with this, and because of this, the nation will suffer, and you get to pick how it will suffer. And David basically picked to be put into the hands of God. He says, I'd rather just fall into your hand rather than fall into the hands of my enemies. And so God was like, all right. So God sent the angel of destruction, and he went through and was striking terror and destruction in Israel, and actually got all the way to Jerusalem. David was mourning the situation, and David apparently looked from the top of this mountain area at the city of Jerusalem, the city that was called the city of David, his own city that he loved, and he sees the arm of the angel of destruction, the angel of death, basically, with a sword, and it's raised with its hand over Jerusalem, and David, in that moment, asks for mercy, and God grants it, and the angel's hand is stayed before it can strike at Jerusalem itself to destroy it. And on the ground where David was, he said, on this ground they will build the temple. So he bought the plot and called it holy ground, and consecrated it for the temple that would be constructed by his son, Shalomo, which means peace, his peace. Okay, so that mountain was actually the Temple Mount, sometimes called Mount Zion, but it has another name, Mount Moriah. It is the same mountain that Isaac was brought by Abraham when God said to Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, the son that you love, take him up to this mountain that I will show you, and offer him there as a whole burnt offering. Abraham took Isaac up onto that mountain. He has his hand raised with the knife in it, about to fall upon Isaac, and an angel stays his hand and keeps him from allowing that knife, that sword, to fall upon Isaac, his son. So there's a history of God staying his hand from the destruction of his beloved, even though in some sense there's desert there. There is a deserving, not with Isaac, but there is at least the need for some sort of a sacrifice because of the sin or failures of the people. Okay, so that is what that Mount Zion actually is. It's Mount Moriah, It's the same mountain, and it was the place where the temple is built. So this is the Temple Mount. Now, I talked to my family about this because I just find this really, really fascinating, and it is not unique to me. Other people have mentioned this, but there are the temple itself represented what? Um, what was the temple in the Old Testament? I'll give you a second to answer it. Like, what was it for? Why did they build it? Why was it? What was its purpose? I guess. See, I've been keeping you on your toes because I have long monologues and then all of a sudden in the middle of it. Yes. Okay. Sweet. Man, Vanessa's killing the chat. So yeah, God's dwelling place on earth. That is what the temple was. It was the place where God dwelt with his people, where God dwells. Yeah, look, Mom, Vanessa, awesome. Great job. Um, yeah. So, oh, and she even corrected. Wow, this is amazing. All right. So yeah, that it's God's dwelling place on earth. It's where God lived or dwelled with his people. And there's actually, the temple itself is holy. Then there's a place within the temple that's called the holy place, which is a little bit more restricted um, than the outer courtyards, which itself was restricted. You weren't allowed to just go in the outer courtyards as anybody. Like the Gentiles weren't allowed there. They had a court outside the inner court that the Gentiles were allowed to come and offer prayers, because there were proselytes that were Gentiles, but they weren't allowed inside the inner court of the temple or the tabernacle. And then there was a place within the tabernacle called the holy place, and this was also in the temple, and only the priests were allowed in there. And that was where the altar of incense and the showbread, the table where they put the bread that represented God's presence with his people and the fellowship that God had with humankind, as well as the menorah, the lamp that had a seven-stemmed lamp that was in there in the holy place. The priests attended to those things, so any of the priests were allowed to be inside that room that were, if they were assigned to address those things, like for instance, to make the bread, replace the bread that was on the table, make sure that the oil continually or the lamp continually had oil in it because it had to be kept going nonstop. And things like that, place the incense in the altar and light it with a coal from the altar that was in the courtyard where they had the burnt offerings. But then there was another place that was even holier than that called the Holy of Holies, and it was sort of the inner room, and the high priest only was allowed in there only one time a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and they went in and sprinkled the blood of the sacrifices onto the covering of the Ark of the Covenant, which was in the Holy of Holies. And it was in that place where the blood was sprinkled between the wings of the cherubim that almost touched over the covering of the altar. Not the altar, but the Ark of the Covenant. That was the place where the presence of God was particularly, and the glory of that presence would fill that whole room. And that was, so this is the situation. So the Holy of Holies is, in a sense, the room where God's presence itself is on earth. So the temple then is heaven on earth. It is that sort of, it represents God's house on earth, which means that it is the place where God's kingdom is centered. It's his palace. It's his royal throne, is the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so what's really interesting is that the original tabernacle that was given to Moses, and we know that the plans for it were given to Moses by God. And actually, in Hebrews, it's made clear that this was from a heavenly pattern, meaning that there was a pattern from heaven that God gave to Moses that Moses then put into the tabernacle, which is why all those signs were so important and had to be so carefully maintained. It was because this is actually God's instructions. And if you get it wrong, then maybe you're misrepresenting something that God wanted to reveal to the people about himself through the temple or the tabernacle. So Moses was given this pattern. Moses did everything according to the pattern that he was given, and in that pattern, the Holy of Holies was a cube, and it was 10 cubits by 10 cubits by 10 cubits, if I remember correctly. It wasn't very large, about 15 feet cubed, and that was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was. Now, you would think if that's adequate for the Ark of the Covenant and as the place where God dwells, you would think that that would stay the same from the tabernacle to the temple, but it doesn't. The Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies, and again, I'd have to look it up. I didn't do this beforehand, but I can tell you for sure that it is bigger. That Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies, in general, the whole temple is bigger. And the second temple is either exactly the same or slightly bigger even than that in the Holy of Holies. However, there's a third temple that was never built, and it was actually prophesied by Ezekiel. He says that he saw it. He was taken by the Spirit, similar to other prophets, and so he was able to see again this sort of heavenly pattern of the temple as it was in heaven, or as God was viewing it. So the third temple that Ezekiel sees, the Holy of Holies, is much larger. The whole temple is much larger, and then you're like, okay, and then okay, so it's like it just seems like the Holy of Holies is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on, as redemptive history unfolds, and then when you get to Revelation, the Holy of Holies, or the city of God, or the temple, which is God's dwelling place, because there's not a temple there, it's the whole city where God dwells. It's as big as a moon, as the moon, I think. It's like 12,000 stadia or something like that. So you have this progressive increase in size of God's dwelling place with his people. Well, I think that what that means, what that indicates, and again, I'm disclosing my bias, but it's not just based on my own speculation or wishful thinking. I think that it's scripturally supported that over time, God's presence on earth and the kingdom of God on earth expands. I mean, you see this in the prophecy of Daniel. It starts as a little stone cut without hands that strikes at the foot of the empire that is of clay and iron, which is Rome. And if you work it out, I mean, it is like you got the head, which is Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, right? You've got the head of Babylon. You've got the arms of silver, which represented Persia. Right? Did it represent? Yeah, Persia. And then you got the abdomen of bronze, which was Greece. And then you got the legs of the First Republic of Rome, and then the legs that were intermixed with clay at the bottom, which was the Empire of Rome, after it had been intermixed. Okay. So that's pretty clear. I mean, that is the course of history there. And so the stone that came, which represented the kingdom of God, from cut without hands, and it comes, and what does it do? It grows and it becomes a mountain until it fills the whole earth. All right, so I'm just, again, disclosing my bias. I believe that the gospel will ultimately have victory on the earth. I'm not a pessimist about it. I think I'm optimistic because of these promises and these commands and these prophecies, that the trajectory of the gospel is that it will eventually create such it will have such an overwhelming impact on all nations, so as to make eventually rule, authority, and power obsolete. Like, it just won't be necessary in order to order society, because society will be ordered from within by people's desire to do what's right. Here's what that's not. So when I was growing up, I believe that this idea, this concept, which was drawn from a lot of the same scriptures that I just brought up, there was still this idea that was a kingdom too, in the way that the other kingdoms were kingdoms, meaning that it's necessary for us to create governments and structures of that are Christian, and that basically force this, Christian utopia onto people, whether or not they want it. I don't think that's the picture that we see in the scriptures. And ultimately, I think any attempts at that will devolve into the same way of power and the same way of corruption that other kingdoms and other empires have devolved into, because it's sort of like the way I see it. I would agree with Tolkien, if you're familiar with his perspective, where the ring of power represented power. And so he believed that power was itself corrupting. I agree. I think that power is corrupting. I agree with Lord Acton on that one. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, in those terms, I don't think that people are fit to wield power. I think the best thing that you can do is bear power. And I think that you have to bear that the best people to bear it are those who won't wield it. So, for instance, the meek, eventually. You could give a meek person power, they wouldn't abuse it, they probably wouldn't even use it. So, in that sense, I think that these Christians, I think a lot of them would call themselves dominionists, who believe in the ultimate victory of God's kingdom. They think that kingdom will be a kingdom like other kingdoms, and it's not. It doesn't function in the same way. And so, in these terms, I make a distinction there, where I'm not saying, hey, what we need to do is establish what amounts to a Christian version of, like the Ottoman Empire, or like they did do with the Holy Roman Empire. Like they literally had a, kingdom of God that was really just an earthly kingdom, and ultimately devolved into corruption and all the things that evil empires typically devolve into, as you might have predicted if you know anything about the nature of power and the nature of empire. So ultimately, what I think is that the gospel will break the way of empire eventually. And I talked to my friend Jeremiah about this today, and it's really interesting to me how God is creating circumstances where that's possible, where human beings really are more and more are being directed to a place where we can either choose the meaning that God has provided for us in human being through salvation and redemption and the pursuit of the way, truth, and life of Jesus, or consciously embrace the meaninglessness and nihilism of a reality in rebellion against God. And I think that dichotomy, the antithesis, the seed of the woman, the seed of the serpent, the wheat and the tares, is just becoming more and more and more obvious and stark and clear as history progresses. Again, it's hard for us to see this because the changes are so slow. So it's like, if you have a kid, or you've ever watched a kid grow up, this. If you spend time with that kid every single day, their growth and their change really sneaks up on you. But if you're away from them for a week, from a baby, if you're away from a baby, even from a teenager for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, or whatever, and you come back, you're like, wow, like so much has changed for you. It's not the case for us, for those of us who have gotten a little bit older, where things don't really change all that much, haven't really changed all that much. Just really slow degradation, and then eventually getting to a precipitous decline. So and then death. So on that cheery note, we can move on to if you guys have any questions or whatnot. I just thought that I would talk about this a little bit, because I talk a lot about the optimism that I have and the trust that I have in God's good plan for the world, and for His people, and for those that for the world that He loves. But I hadn't really expressed directly that is what I actually do believe, and that it does shape the way I see current events, political realities, things like that. I don't really buy all that much into global conspiracy theories or cabals, or all these kinds of things. Mostly because, to me, it's like, well, why do the nations rage? I mean, they can huff and they can fight and they can try to break their chains, but in the truth and the reality of it is that ultimately the truth is the truth, and lies will fail, and I believe that. And so I think, in the short term, um, I think it can look real bad, but in the long term, folly is not sustainable. It's one of my favorite things about folly. Uh, Vanessa asks, does power corrupt, or does power in the hands of power hungry people corrupt? I think power corrupts. I think it just does. Um, I do think, obviously, that power in the hands of people who are seeking power as a primary goal is far more corrupting and far more abusive. But I think that power in itself um, is has a tendency to corrupt. Yeah, I don't. I think it's very hard to hold power without it affecting you in various different ways. And one of the ways, uh, well, okay, that's true. Power doesn't corrupt God, and I agree with you. God is able to wield power without corruption. Um, and he is also able, he obviously bears it. But part of the reason is that God is perfectly self controlled, as we've talked about the fruit of the Spirit, self control. If it's a fruit of the Spirit, that means that it's in the character of God. So that means that God himself has self control. And that the thing about power is that in order to bear it and not wield it, it's very, very difficult unless you have a massive amount of self control. Especially, I mean, consider. I just go back to and continually meditate on that picture of Jesus on the cross with everybody around him mocking him, thinking that they've beat him, and saying ridiculous things like, "If you're the Son of God, why don't you call your angel armies down and strike us down?" And it's like he could have. He like actually could have done that, and yet he restrained himself. So in that sense, but when you look at him, like if you're looking at Jesus, you're not necessarily saying, "Huh, like he looks really powerful up there." The problem with power and having power is it's sort of like Chekhov's gun. Like when it exists, you want to use it. You want to see it being used. And it's such a temptation, like when you have power, to wield it rather than just to hold it. And the amount of self control and the amount of self discipline and really security and stability that you would have to have in order to have power and never use it. Because that's really, I mean, rarely use it only in dire circumstances and only for the purpose of helping other people. And even God himself, I mean, so many times when he could use power and he doesn't. Even to the point of, like, think about the gospel. Like the gospel is an invitation, and God honors our choice concerning it. That's incredible. He doesn't have to. He could like seriously reach down and change everybody's heart like immediately and just make everything right. And we couldn't resist it. We couldn't make it not so. The only reason why there's even the possibility of resisting the offer of the gospel is because God allows that of us, which means that he controls himself from using power that he actually has. So, so God, obviously, power doesn't corrupt God. I guess I'm saying power tends to corrupt because most people are not willing to not use it. And you just sit there and you're like, I'm butting up against these obstacles. Everybody is, fighting me or resisting me or whatever. I mean, think about Jesus. Everybody's resisting me and scorning me and putting me in this position. Man, if I could just, it's just a little bit of power. If I could just take a little bit of that power and just maybe push a little bit, then maybe I can get, things done. Maybe I can get things moving. So the kind of patience that it takes to withhold that temptation is pretty great. And think about the number of times in your life where, man, if I had the power to get this pushed through, I would do it. very rarely is it the case where it's like, I have the power to do what I desire, but I'm not going to do it. You know? Um, Vanessa says, yeah, God is the only one who can use power properly, which is another reason why he wanted us to worship and honor him alone. He wanted to be our king. Yeah, interestingly, and I'll talk about this in the episode where I talk about the kingdom. God is not called the king very, very much. And when he is called the king, it kind of seems like it's just a record of somebody else calling him king. Like, for instance, here's an interesting bit. Nebuchadnezzar is one of the only people in the Old Testament who calls God the king. He's called the God of heaven and earth. He's called the ruler. Well, not really. He's called the possessor of heaven and earth. He's called the creator. He's called the maker. I mean, he's called all sorts of things that would indicate that he has authority over heaven and earth, but very rarely called a king, if at all, which is really strange. And in fact, God himself says that he has a king. Now, not that there's a king over him, but that, for instance, in Psalm 2, it says, I have anointed, in God's talking, he says, I have anointed my king on Mount Zion. And we know because in Revelation, when Jesus comes riding in on his white charger, there is on his thigh is written King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So we know that Jesus is Lord and King of the universe. But aside from the Jewish prayer that says, Lord God, King of the universe, and then has all sorts of petitions and stuff, there are a lot of Jewish prayers that start, God, King of the universe. But that's not really in the Old Testament. It's really interesting. Like, God doesn't really take to himself this title of king. And the time when you see king being applied, it's being applied to God's Messiah, God's Christ. Even in Psalm 2, it is when God says, I have appointed my anointed as king on this holy mountain. The word for anointed is the word, Messiah, which in Greek would be Christ or Christos. So it's very interesting that Jesus is king, and God grants to Jesus all rule, power, and authority. What's very interesting is that Jesus' intention with having all rule, power, and authority is to eventually abolish it. Like, he's like, I am taking rule, power, and authority so that it can be abolished. Notice also what was offered to Jesus by Satan, which was all the kingdoms of the world, so that Jesus would be king of all the kingdoms. But in that temptation, he would be king the way that those kings of the kingdoms of the earth had been king. The way he chose instead to be king of all the universe was in the way that God is king, in the sense that God doesn't grasp to himself the power that he has. He does not feel the need to exercise it in the way that earthly kings do for their own glory, for their own honor, for their own aggrandizement. Instead, he exercises power as a good king would, for the purpose of protecting and caring for his people, and really, desiring ultimately that the power necessary to protect his people eventually and ultimately would be abolished, that there would no longer be any need for any evils of any kind in his kingdom that is free from all curses. So anyway, that's a short, not so short, talk about kingdom, and I'll be getting into that in a little bit more depth, and particularly concerning the Lord's Prayer here in the next episode. I'm working on it right now. I've been really fascinated by the things that I'm learning in the scriptures concerning the idea of kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdoms of earth. And so I'm very I'm excited to share that with you. Ooh, there's thunder outside. I don't know if you can hear it because this mic is pretty good at directing off-axis noises, but yeah, it's raining out and thunder. All right, well, that's about all I have. Do you all have any questions or any comments or anything like that? I I'm I'm happy to field them, talk about them. I've been doing a lot of work here while I wait for comments, if there are any. On my Patreon, I did a video where I talked a little bit about. Let's see if I can. This thing. Yeah, here we go. I'm so bad. I like don't it's backwards or whatever. But yeah, this thing right here. This is the diffuser. If I Here's a cool thing too. This camera will autofocus. You can't hear me as well anymore. So, did you see it? Anyway, it's pretty cool. That's a diffuser that I made. I made a video of it in my most recent Patreon update where I shared with people how we did it. But my dad and I built it together. And then let's see if I can. Yeah, my drums are together. Oh, you see these red guys back here? Those are my congas that I just got from Blairsville. And we're also in the process of building the bass traps in the corners. So and that I'm pretty excited about that. Here, I'm gonna show you something. So this one in this corner, because it has a closet, is gonna be on wheels. So I got some wheels set up on that, and it's gonna be able to wheel in and out of the closet corner right here. There's a closet right there, and so. Yeah, that it is cool. The background comes into focus. I can't. It's like there's a focal length, and this camera's focal length is really tight, which is why it's so blurry back behind me. But basically, it's like a depth of focus, and you can broaden that depth of focus, and it will make everything a little bit flatter by bringing more things into focus at the same time. But the focal depth on this camera is pretty narrow. It's pretty tight. I think I could broaden it, but I kind of like the way it looks. You guys can let me know if you hate it. But I feel like looking pretty good. So I've got a lot more work to do on the studio to get it into shape for being able to record music here. Um, and I I'm gonna continue to work with my dad. We've got some panels. My wife is helping me. We got some cloth samples in for the panels today, and so we've chosen a cloth color for the burlap. And anyway, it's looking good in here. Things are going pretty well, um, and I'm trying to get into a productive rhythm. It's just very hard while I'm working on all these additional things that I hadn't really planned on doing. Um, it makes it a little bit more difficult to get into a regular rhythm on a lot of things until I have everything done here, and then I can sort of settle back in without all this extra work. But all the little DIY projects getting this place in order have consumed a lot of my additional time. But it's coming together and it's working out pretty well. And pretty soon I will have everything here that as I intended for it to be, and then I'll get back to your regular scheduled programming. Um, if you do have any questions or anything, you can always comment on any of my articles or on my podcasts on my website, which is michaelminkoff.com or nothinghumanpodcast.com. So you can go on there and you can comment on anything if you have any questions when you're listening to the podcast or anything else. Or you can, if you know me, I'm pretty sure that my mom has my cell phone number. So you can text me directly. Vanessa, my wife, does not have my cell phone number. No, I'm just joking. But yeah, You can always text me if you have any questions or anything like that, and I'll include them here. And it's helpful to me to have questions beforehand a little bit. Also, on my Patreon, I have a chat section where people will send questions. If you're a Patreon supporter, feel free to get on the chat and ask me questions there. And I'll also use those on this. So, anyway, there's lots of different ways to ask me questions if you ever want to. Anyway, um, I'm going to be leaving this Thursday night and then Friday morning. Well, I'll be spending the night at a friend's house Thursday night to drive with him on Friday morning to Louisiana. And so please pray with me for this family in Louisiana. One of our good friends from my kind of man group. I have a group of men that are on a text thread all year long, and we send each other family updates and family pictures and stupid jokes and stuff like that, and just whatever. We just keep up with one another. That way, on the group thread, there's 8 or 9 of us on there, and then every year we get together in person. And one of that group, my friend Brad. His eldest son, who's 29, was in a car accident and suffered severe head trauma and went into a coma and died a few days later. And so, if you would pray for his son's name was Stephen, but Brad and Adrian. If you would pray for them, I would really appreciate it, because I don't really know. It's unimaginable. So anyway, if you would pray for them, I'd really appreciate it. We're going to go to the memorial service, or I'm going to the memorial service with a bunch of our man group thread guys. So it should be a good time, but it's just really hard thinking, like, imagining what that would be like to go through. So anyway, if you would pray for Brad and Adrian, I would really appreciate it. Okay, well, it was great talking to you, and thank you for getting in on the chat, Mom Vanessa. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or whatever, just let me know. All right, I will talk to you soon.